Professor Mark Woolhouse, welcome to In Conversation.
I'm very pleased to be here.
The UK has now declared Freedom Day, no more masks, no social distancing. Is this the sensible, calculated risk, the path forward, or are we looking at a potential disaster?
I'm sure we're not looking at a disaster, and at some point, every country in the world, especially the UK, in my case, is going to have to come out of restrictions. We're going to have to exit. So the question is how to do that safely. Most epidemiological analyses indicate that whenever any country relaxes restrictions, they are going to see some kind of exit wave, whatever their epidemiological situation at the moment is. And so what we need to ensure is that those exit waves are manageable and do not place an intolerable burden on the health system and don't cause a major public health problem.
Well, if we look though at the vaccination rate, because that's really what's allowing this to happen for the countries who are fortunate enough to come up to that, 70% of the population, that's when this opening up can take place. But what's going to happen with all the countries where we're not seeing that level of vaccination? I mean, in other words, what can they learn from the UK experiment?
Well, first of all, I don't think the UK is conducting an experiment. What we're doing is conducting a public health problem to try and minimize the impact of this very unpleasant disease, both individually and at a population level. I think what was missed early on in this pandemic around the world, I think this is a very important point, was the necessity that whatever interventions we introduce, they have to be sustainable. I think too many governments, too many scientists, too many advisors held on for too long the idea that this was in some way a short-lived problem, that if we dealt with it effectively in the first weeks, that it would in some sense be over. That was never, ever likely to be the case. Once novel coronavirus became established globally in the way that it did as early as February 2020, there was no going back. This was not going to be eliminated, eradicated the way that SARS was back in 2003. This was now an established pathogen. And we were going to have to live not only with the consequences of the infection, but the consequences of our attempts to manage it. Now, obviously, the vaccines, which you alluded to, make the possibility of sustainably managing this infection, brings them much, much closer. But it's still, as you're seeing in the UK, still a challenge, even with relatively high levels of vaccination. But it is a new phase of the pandemic, and working out in the UK and for other countries subsequently what the right balance is between the part of the load borne by the vaccination program and what other measures we may have to keep in place to keep the infection manageable, that's still to be worked out. I wouldn't say it's an experiment, it's more of an exploration where we have to find that out. But the key word here, and has been all along, is sustainable. Whatever we do, it must be sustainable. And these very severe lockdowns that we're still seeing enforced in many parts of the world, not least Australia at the moment, are clearly not sustainable.
Most of us now are pretty fixated in looking at the daily numbers of infections. But what about those who say that what we should be looking at is the number of people in the ICU and the number of deaths?
Depends very much who's doing the looking. From a government, a political perspective, obviously it's the burden on the health system and the mortality rates are key indicators. But that's always been the case. I mean, you're saying that indeed not all cases translate into hospitalizations and deaths. But for 50% of the population, we've known from the very early stages, the risk from an infection is actually very low indeed, for at least 50% of the population. So it's always been the case that we need to consider not just how many infections there are, but who's getting them. And we've always had to be more concerned about infections in the elderly, the frail, and the vulnerable, because they are vastly more at risk than the young and healthy, and always have been. But now we have another factor to put into the calculation, which is what people's immune status is. It makes a difference whether people that are being exposed have been partially vaccinated, fully vaccinated, perhaps even what vaccine they've had, but also whether they've had previous natural exposure. So we need to know much more about those individual cases if we're going to make any assessment about whether they're likely to translate into hospitalizations and deaths.
Given that Southeast Asia is probably maybe a few weeks back on what's been taking place in terms of the vaccination rollout, at least, compared with Europe, is there anything that you could say that we ought to look out for?
In terms of the vaccine rollout, I think the UK model has worked very well, and it was proving very effective. So if the UK had not had the Delta variant, I think there would be no conversation at all about how safe it was to unlock restrictions at this stage of the UK epidemic over the summer. In fact, I think most of the discussion would be that we did it too slowly, that we were too cautious, that in fact, the UK was effectively protected when most of the most vulnerable people were protected back in the spring, and we could have unlocked much sooner. But the Delta variant changed the rules of the game, and it's made that much more harder. So my recommendation to every other country that's unrolling their vaccination program is to be flexible. So when the data are in your favor, as they were in the UK in the spring, you can afford to relax measures safely and sooner. But if circumstances change, if, for example, another new variant does appear, or there's any other unexpected consequences or effects of the vaccine rollout, then you have to be prepared to change your course of action. One mistake we made in the UK, in my view, was to be so adamant that the lifting of restrictions this time round had to be irreversible. It could never go backwards. Well, that's a very hard promise to make in public health terms when you're dealing with such a still unknown quantity as novel coronavirus. We couldn't guarantee we wouldn't get other variants, or indeed that there are other problems, and that's what happened. We got the Delta variant.
Do you think that vaccination ought to be compulsory?
I think different countries, different societies may answer that question differently. My personal preference, but this is I'm just one voice of thousands here, but my personal preference is for more carrot than stick. So in my group, we've looked at some of the effectiveness of schemes like vaccine passports and allowing people that have been double vaccinated to undertake many activities they would have done before COVID-19 came to us. And that, in our analyses, looks to be actually a very effective public health tool. So vaccine passports, if they're designed to allow people to do things that they want to do and helps them to do that safely, then maybe that will encourage more people to get vaccinated. But this, in the UK and elsewhere, is a very controversial topic. Lots of people have lots of different views on this. There are some people who are adamant that vaccine passports are not the way forward. But simply speaking, as an epidemiologist, I think they would work.
What about someone who says to you, but then, Prof, what's the point of my being vaccinated? The variants will come along and I will end up being, getting the infection anyway. So what's the point?
We've done a lot of work on this in Scotland, where we've been able to link the records on vaccination to the histories of infections and treatment and hospitalizations. We've clearly shown that the vaccines have a very marked effect on severe illness, probably up in the 90% levels of protection once you're double vaccinated. That's a very significant benefit, and certainly I and more importantly, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation here in the UK recommends that all over 18-year-olds do get fully vaccinated. It certainly will make a big difference to the risk of them contracting severe or even just incapacitating disease.
What if we end up with a situation of vaccine resistance? If the virus, so to say, gets so clever that even if we're vaccinated, it doesn't matter?
Well, there's two parts to that question. I mean, first of all, the vaccine by itself may not be enough to keep the Delta variant fully under control. And that's all about whether we build up enough herd immunity through vaccination, but also through natural infection, that we reach the herd immunity threshold. And if we do reach the herd immunity threshold, what that means is that the virus would not be able to take off again in the way that it has in the past. We'd still get cases, we'd still get transmission, we'd still get outbreaks, but we wouldn't get any major waves of the way that the UK and many other countries have experienced. That remains an open question. Are these vaccines good enough to get us across the herd immunity threshold for the Delta variant? And it's not yet certain that we can. But you asked a more difficult question, was what if there's another vaccine escape mutant that the vaccines are less effective against or is even more transmissible than Delta? And quite obviously, we have to expect, given the history of this virus, that such variants will come along in the coming months and years. But it is very, very difficult to know exactly how much more transmissible and how much more able they are to evade the vaccines at this point. So the answer to that is surveillance, and particularly genomic surveillance and variant surveillance. And that is not just the responsibility of the UK, although our genomic surveillance is world leading in that respect, but this has to be global. So the sorts of level of surveillance you're seeing in the UK, the further and the wider that we can spread that around the world, the better for everyone in the world, so that we understand what's coming next.
Do you see a time when even very young children are going to be vaccinated?
This is a very difficult question indeed. There are a number of different dimensions to it. First of all, there's the risk to the children. This is another thing I think the whole world was very slow to realize back in the early months of 2020, that just like SARS before it, the risk to children from this new virus is really very, very small, unless they have well-recognized underlying frailties or comorbidities, then the risk to children is very small. But the children will grow older. They will become adults. And as they grow older, the risk certainly from the first infection from novel coronavirus increases. So at some point, looking forward, everybody is going to either be exposed to the virus naturally at whatever age, or they're going to be vaccinated. So there is an argument that, well, you're going to have the vaccine at some stage. Otherwise, you're going to have natural infection. It's certainly better to be vaccinated before you get as old as I am, because the infection consequently much worse as children than it is for children. So this is a very, very difficult balance to strike. The other dimension to it, even more difficult, is the role that children play in transmitting the virus. And then, of course, the question becomes, if you don't vaccinate the children, can you ever reach the herd immunity threshold? Will the virus just continue to circulate in children and in schools, spill over occasionally to vulnerable people that aren't fully protected by the vaccine, and the public health burden remains? We still don't know that yet. Children do transmit the virus, but mostly they do it at a much lower rate than adults do. So it's an open question.
Professor, are all vaccines, though, created equal?
No, they're not. They're not equal in terms of their efficacy, and they also have different safety problems. Now, the latter point, I really don't want to overstress too much. It's a maxim that no medication is absolutely 100% safe, but these are really safe products. The number of problems reported around the world are very, very few, but they do exist, and they mustn't be ignored, and they're different in the different kind of vaccines. And many countries have chosen, for example, including the UK, to concentrate on some of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, for example, rather than the AstraZeneca vaccines for younger adults. But even the AstraZeneca vaccine, there was absolutely no question that for a very, very large number of people, the risks from the vaccine are tiny in comparison to the risks from novel coronavirus. So for someone like me, there's absolutely no question about where the risk lies, and it's right to be double vaccinated. In terms of efficacy, well, they're not identical, but they're turning out to be more similar than we first thought.
So we're not saying, in other words, that the mRNA vaccinations are better than, let's say, for example, the ones that are more traditional, like Sinovac.
Yes, I mean, and they have pros and cons. And don't forget, one of the things you have to think about, particularly when you're vaccinating the whole world, is ultimately cost, but also how easy they are to handle, how easily they are to distribute. So there's cold chain problems with the mRNA vaccines that are particularly challenging. So all of these things have to be factored in, and I can quite see where different vaccines turn out to be optimal in different circumstances and different contexts. But I think so far they all have a role to play. And yes, of course, the vaccine technology will continue to evolve. It's brand new.
What about the question of booster shots?
Yes, there's a lot of interest in this. One of the models for natural immunity against novel coronavirus is that because there are so many variants circulating and more are likely to appear, that it may be that natural immunity is also boosted. The first variant you get gives you some level of infection, but you get another variant later and so on. You actually build up better and better protection over time with more and more exposures. And it may be that something similar like that happens with the vaccines. So as you further vaccine, perhaps different kinds of vaccine, booster vaccinations and so on, that your immunity does build up ever more strongly, closer and closer to full protection. But this is all something we have to monitor carefully.
Well, we have, though, a bit of a rich and poor divide, though. Where rich countries will have things like booster shots, but poor countries may not even have their first or second jabs yet.
We always have had a rich and poor divide. Myself and many colleagues around the world have been doing our utmost to try and level the playing field, not just for novel coronavirus, but for many other kinds of disease and infectious disease for many years. This is something we have to deal with. I think in the middle term, the solution to this is surely to increase our vaccination production capacity. And I've been working with colleagues in Africa to try and enable the production of vaccines in Africa at the moment. They're mainly relying on imported vaccines, not just for novel coronavirus, but for many other infections. And I think in the medium to long term, that is the answer, to make sure that every part of the world has the vaccine production capacity that it needs. But I realize that's not a quick fix. That's not something we can do in a few weeks. Although, having said that, it's remarkable how much vaccine has been produced globally. So let's not take our foot off the gas. Let's keep on pressing for ever better, safer, and more efficient vaccine production capacity all around the world and get this done.
One of the things, though, that WHO has said, the World Health Organization has said, though, is that we're not safe until we're all safe.
I love the sentiments of this phrase that no one's safe till everyone's safe. But it does worry me slightly from a global health perspective in two respects. First of all, it suggests that in the foreseeable future, there will come a time when literally everybody is safe, which to me implies that novel coronavirus is no longer a public health threat anywhere in the world. Realistically, I cannot see that happening in my lifetime. So it sort of sets a false goal. And the other thing, it that phrase does is set too big a dichotomy. Yes, in a way, no one is safe till everyone is safe. But the more people who are safer, the safer we all are. It's not an all or nothing thing. It's a continuum.
And from a simplistic sort of point of view, would you say that you're optimistic or pessimistic?
I am much more optimistic now than I was back in January. The vaccines were developed in remarkable time, but beyond that, they are actually remarkably effective. And if you recall that the World Health Organization set a standard for the vaccine trials that would have been just 50% protection would have been enough to unroll a vaccine. Well, as we were discussing earlier, they are much, much, much better than that. So the vaccines have given us the prospect of managing novel coronavirus in the future from a public health perspective, really very effectively indeed. So I am optimistic that the majority of the public health burden can be reduced. But let's face it, at a global level, that's going to take years, not months, to achieve. But I'm not so optimistic that I think we'll be able to go set the clock back, to fully go back to where we were before in early 2020. We have a new and very serious respiratory infection plaguing humanity, and we are going to have to deal with it for the foreseeable future. So no, we can't set the clock back, but I'm optimistic, thanks to the excellent efficacy of the vaccines, that we can manage this public health problem as we do so many others going forward.
And that we would still have a life worth living.
Oh, absolutely, yes.
Professor, thank you very much for being on In Conversation.
You're very welcome. It's been a pleasure.